Good afternoon.
It is very rough.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone, to our first afternoon session. My name is Ryan Jobson. I'm an assistant professor in the departments of Anthropology and Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity. Also director of doctoral studies for CEGU for this academic year. Our first session this afternoon is titled Landscapes of Intensification. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce and turn it over to our guest speakers this afternoon. But I was asked to offer some prefatory remarks by Neil. And I'd really like to take up Frederick's charge from last night to inhabit the category of intensification, not simply as a symptom of something that we might call a great acceleration of energy capture, enclosure, and technological innovation, but also as a metabolic intensification of circuits of energetic production, consumption, waste, and embodiment. So I'm thinking about the first session this morning and sort of Robert's proposal toward energy palimpsest or palimpsestive energy contra the language of energy transitions, for instance. To think of, or to speak of landscapes of intensification is also then in a palimpsestic quality to consider what's scraped away, what's left behind as remainder and residue, what's imprinted on the landscape amidst the vex motion of something that we call energy transition. So how do landscapes both serve as a vibrant archive of intensification, not simply as monuments to the great acceleration, but also as a locus of waste, of runoff, of radioactivity, of toxic and feral proliferations? Also, what happens when we alert ourselves to these metabolic remainders and afterlives, rather than simply the teleological sequence of historical materialist stages or attendant energy transitions? So I've been really stuck actually after last night's dual keynote about a category that we might call petronostalgia, right? That we could think of that as manifesting as petronostalgia with a small p, we might say, of like truck and SUV ownership, and then particularly this kind of skepticism toward EVs, even when they come in the same form of trucks and SUVs. You can also think about petrostate nostalgia as that which continues to inhabit the form of the petrostate as an engine of political futures, both post-colonial and otherwise, even as the market and geologic conditions that gave shape to the petrostate seem to recede from the horizon of our political present. So in this way, sort of, it both continues to serve as a constitutive horizon of liberal modernization, but also of anti-imperialist sentiments. So Lale, I'm thinking about the nostalgia for the conditions that sparked the wave of nationalization in OPEC countries, for instance, as a sort of model that is looked at, and often there's an attempt to resuscitate. I'll just say very briefly, in the landscape with which I'm most familiar in Trinidad and Tobago, we can think about the shuttering of the state-owned refinery at Pointe-a-Pierre in 2018 as a moment that both signaled at once an end to the epic of state-led industrialization, but one that hasn't drawn an end to the form of the petrostate. I'm thinking about Dominic's comments here. So today, the refinery, which is visible from the sort of large north-south highway in Trinidad, is no longer characterized by the sort of luminous gas flares that distinguished it for over a century of operations, but rather its quiet status at rest against the landscape of central Trinidad that sort of appears to us. We can think of it both as a material edifice of petronostalgia, a reminder of what the sort of moment of state-led industrialization and often sort of ascent to the middle class for many working class Trinbagonians. But it's also now a political device to be wielded in the name of petronostalgia. There's an election coming up next week in Trinidad. And again, one of the main talking points has been about either the political error of closing the refinery or the promise to resuscitate the refinery by reviving upstream oil production and indeed bringing the refinery back on stream. So again, we could think about sort of how the remainder of the shuttered refinery inhabits a landscape of intensification, of rusting infrastructure and toxic afterlives, but that's felt as a sort of affect of slowdown, of retrenchment and deceleration. I think we can also sort of extend this to think about cognate forms of sort of industrial nostalgia, coal nostalgia, hydro nostalgia, nuclear nostalgia that characterize, particularly in post-colonial contexts, a sort of horizon of possibility at a particular moment. But with this, I'm going to turn it over to our two speakers. First, we'll have Sachaet Pandey, who's a PhD candidate in the University of Chicago's History Department. His current work follows the transformations affected by hydroelectricity in Western India and examines their conceptual foundations. He will be followed by Robin McDowell, who's visiting assistant professor of history at Wesleyan University and an incoming assistant professor of environmental studies at Bates College. Her first book project, Black Bayou, Race, Ecology, and the Transformation of Louisiana Wetlands, explores historical dimensions of environmental racism and visions for environmental justice in Southeast Louisiana. But Sachaet, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. I have no slides to share, no graphs or visuals for you to take pictures of, but I do have a story to tell you that I hope will grip and affect you in the way that it has affected me. Across the 20th century, an electric grid in Western India transformed the contours of the land in which it took shape and the lives of millions even further afield, before marking an epochal change in 1967 by occasioning the largest earthquake to have ever been triggered by human activity. In the seasonally rain-washed Sahyadri Mountains that obstruct the monsoon clouds as they move from ocean to subcontinent, the minds behind this vast grid of human and non-human beings attempted to construct a system that would be free from the very seasonality that made its assembly possible. In this presentation, I will dig into the foundations of this dam system in order to lay bare its connections with the modern understanding of freedom, before showing how the material unfolding of this grid challenged the ideas on which it was founded. In 1872, M.G. Ranade developed an argument that would be reiterated in the subcontinent in various forms over the next century. In a public lecture delivered in the regional vernacular, Ranade exhorted his countrymen to industrialize, urging them to think about whether the ongoing process of ruralization under colonial rule was desirable or not. Agriculture, he argued, was an occupation that was structurally unfree, determined as it was by nature's customs, by conditions given to man like time, place, and season. To Ranade, who was grudgingly acknowledged to be the first man of his age by even his severest critics, industrialization represented a possible overcoming of this thraldom to nature, as well as to the prevailing global division of labor under which his countrymen exported raw materials and were forced to buy finished goods from abroad. Industry, he insisted, would enable people to lead lives that were less dependent on forces outside human control, thereby increasing not only the wealth and happiness of a nation, but also its swadhinpan, which is to say, its self-dependence of freedom. Ranade lived through the numerous famines that devastated India in the late 19th century, and in his thought, like in that of his contemporaries, the psychic wounds left by these late Victorian holocausts display themselves discernibly. To the intellectuals, politicians, and reformers of the period who are now remembered as Indian nationalists, famines were recurrent possibilities, ever present on their anticipatory horizons, and required structural transformations to ward off. As agriculture came to be associated with unfreedom or other dependence, industrialization came to be thought of as a way to approach self-determination. Now, this approach converges with some well-worn pathways in modern thinking, exemplified in Hegel's philosophy of right, which argues that the agricultural class is condemned to be subservient to nature, given the dependence of this activity on natural conditions like place, time, and season. While the colonial government was liable to be influenced by capitalists at home to restructure tariffs, their role in the incubation of industrial civilization in India should not be underrated. In the aftermath of a long famine that stretched from 1876 to 1878, claiming at least 8 million lives, a statutory famine commission came out with a report that neatly delineates the ruling ontology's perspective. A main cause of the disastrous consequences of Indian famines, the report argues, is to be found in the fact that the great mass of the population directly depends on agriculture and that there is no other industry from which any considerable part of the community derives its support. The complete remedy for this condition of things will be found only in the development of industries other than agriculture and independent of the fluctuations of the seasons. This syllogistic idea that industry could reduce Indian poverty and vulnerability to famine by reducing the dependence of the masses on nature was gaining ground. And ground did it not only gain, but it also did provide. In November 1900, with famines in the past, present, and future weighing heavily on the official mind, Jamsetji Tata found the Secretary of State for India in a receptive mood for his schemes to develop Indian industry. For an intramontane hydroelectric project that faced the industrial metropolis of Bombay, Tata, the pioneer of what has become today India's largest conglomerate, wanted one thing above all else: land. And he wanted the government to acquire it for him. The Tata scheme was a radical one from an engineering point of view. Unlike other water power schemes, which utilized water from existing rivers or lakes, this one sought to generate electricity throughout the year from valleys which had from time immemorial been dry for 9 months of the year and where no water had been previously stored. During the 90 odd days when monsoon winds were met by the hills that towered over these valleys, however, they experienced some of the most intense rainfall in the world. Tata and his associates wanted to turn these valleys into massive lakes from which water would no longer flow into the sea, but into turbines installed at the feet of mountains, doubly recruiting the region's topography. First, as a receptacle for water, and then as an accelerant for this water, which would fall from a significant height, rapidly turning magnetic blades to generate electricity. From the very outset of this project, engineers and those intimately involved began to experience a troubling uncertainty. What if they weren't able to collect enough water? Since rain fell here but once a year, if the dams weren't able to impound enough water during the monsoon season, the scheme's capacity to supply energy to consumers for the rest of the year would be damned. In contemplating this problem and in devising the solution that they did, the first movers of this project embarked on a path that their successors across the next half century would continue to bear down on. In order to free themselves from the uncertainties of seasonal rainfall, these consummate men of modernity sought to scale up the sizes of their reservoirs, converting large tracts of land into artificial lakes in an attempt to create landscapes where they felt like they could exercise a degree of self determination over and against that which was outside their control. The first scheme itself created no less than 3 lakes, but as demand for energy in Bombay surged during the First World War and immediately after, the Tatas set off in search of more land in the Sahyadris. 2 more projects soon followed, with the colonial government providing crucial support in the form of land acquisition. As the projects grew larger and larger, the Tatas met with opposition from people whose ways of life would be annihilated by the submergence of their villages. In the 1920s, widespread opposition from the residents of Mulshi crystallized into what has been referred to as the world's first anti dam movement, with the aid of journalists and revolutionaries from nearby Pune, who sought to give the struggle a distinctly nationalist and anti capitalist identity. But these modern arguments were not the only ones that the inhabitants of Mulshi put forward. In a petition, they appealed to the government not as to a court of law applying the provisions of an act, but as the guardians and protectors of thousands of poor rayats, or farmers. In this region, they pleaded, inhabitants had their family idols and public shrines, which they revered with a devotion that strangers could never imagine. There could be no standard of comparison, they argued, that could measure the miseries of homeless wanderers against the pleasures of electric fans to be enjoyed by the people of Bombay. In response, the colonial state and the Tatars drew on a set of arguments that had by this time become almost intuitively available in the Indian discursive world. In a meeting with the petitioners, the government stood decisively in favor of the hydro scheme. The industrial development of the country would be impossible unless they encouraged such projects, they argued. And furthermore, the present one was not the last of its kind, and so the attempt to oppose the Tata scheme was as futile as the attempt of a calf, a baby cow, to oppose the career of the Gujarat mail, so a very fast train. The Tatas issued a much more sophisticated statement to the public, linking their project with industrial development, agriculture with poverty, and conceptually united the expropriation of the villagers with the development of the national good. Mulshi responded with a clarion call to the nation of its own, taking apart elements of this conceptual totality that was being weaponized against them. This was a plan to de ruralize them, they recognized, to make them a part of the urban proletariat under the inevitable serfdom of capitalism. But Mulshi was a healthy region. Rainfall was plentiful. Land was fertile. Trees bore mangoes, guavas, ingredients for Ayurveda, honey. They grew good rice, all of which they had enough of to share with other Indians. Instead of driving people out of Mulshi, the government needed to encourage people from famine stricken districts to migrate there. But even as it expressed its revulsion for capitalism, this transvaluation of the region revealed its entrapment within the totality that was authorizing this project. They did want India to develop her industries and take her place in the front rank of nations, they said, and even saw some truth in the idea that no sacrifice was too great for the industrial advancement of their land. But to them, since the present was indelibly tainted by colonialism and capitalism, industrial development was meaningless until the day of India's Swaraj or self determination, when the nation would properly mediate the productive process. But the state and capital were unmoved and refused to admit Mulshi into the waiting room of modernity. The dam was built and the villages were submerged. And so the modern conception of freedom, qua self determination, came to determine the emergence and growth of this hydroelectric grid in two primary ways. First, through its diffusion within a conceptual world that legitimized this infrastructure's coming into being, and also more concretely as the content of the will that strove to create a landscape in which the system was less dependent on an other than it was on itself. The 1930s witnessed a relative plateau in energy demand in the region in the aftermath of the Great Depression, but demand rebounded during the Second World War and continued to rise in the post colonial period, with the independent Indian states' push to increase industrial production. By the 1940s, the Tatars were dominating Mumbai's electric scene. So when India awoke to her tryst with destiny in 1947, more than half of the entire nation state's installed capacity was under the grid's control, and most of it went to the city. But the Tatas soon became victims of their own success. Even though the company invested in improvements and upgrades, there were no increases in their water reserves after they submerged Mulshi. Having become monopolists by eliminating all other energy companies in the region with aggressive pricing and consumer acquisition strategies, the Tata Lakes were being pushed to their absolute capacity. When the monsoons failed to meet their expectations, a state of affairs was brought into being that would have unsettled Rana Day and perhaps even Hegel. The Tatas were the primary source of energy for industries in Bombay, for its railways, and for its only public utilities company. Without Tata hydroelectricity, the city's metabolism was effectively de energized. And since the grid depended, in spite of itself, on the capricious gift of nature that is the South Asian monsoon, seasonal bequests that didn't measure up to the quantitative expectations of the Tatas had qualitative reverberations for the city. In such years, scores of workers in India's industrial nucleus found themselves out of work, facing uncertainty as industries were starved for energy to run the machines that they had by now adapted to the electric drive. Domestic consumption was severely rationed, as was supply for religious ceremonies and festivals. The state even clamped down on weddings, paring down these grand celebrations to mere 3-day affairs. Newspapers call this a power famine. In the late 19th century, Indian intellectuals and British officials placed their faith in industrial development as a solution to the dependence that they felt the Indian poor was subjected to as a consequence of their agricultural way of life. and its close ties with forces beyond human control. But now, in independent India's largest industrial city, a state of affairs had begun to prevail in the late 1940s, wherein industry itself became subjected to the capriciousness and unpredictability to which it was supposed to be a solution. Famines were declared in India only when monsoons failed significantly, throwing people who were dependent on the land onto the mercy of the state or the market. In 1951, however, even though the monsoons fell short of the yearly mean by just 25%, a power famine was proclaimed, with serious implications for the city. Initially, industrialists shrewdly transferred the losses they incurred as a result of shorter working hours to their wage bills. But after a century of industrial development in the city, the working people were not as bereft of power during this new kind of famine as their counterparts had been in the countryside. Decades of struggle had forged strong labor unions, and the new government, constituted on the principle of popular sovereignty, recognized its duty to the masses. Shifts and working hours in industry came to be closely regulated by schedules drawn up by representatives of labor, government, capital, and the Tatas, preventing capitalists from persisting in the ongoing practice of reducing wages by up to 35%. We may imagine Rana Day and perhaps even Hegel smiling wryly. But this state of affairs was a state of exception, one that all involved were keen on exiting. Losses in the city owing to the power famine amounted to a third of the total amount that the entire country was spending on electrical installations every year. Having recovered the prerogative to develop the nation's water resources from private interests, the state now undertook a project that had only been whispered about in the corridors of power, often coming close to actualization, but never quite coming into being. Koyna. Like previous hydroelectric projects in the Western Ghats, it too was doubly mediated by the modern understanding of freedom as self determination. Most conspicuously, it was embarked upon by the state government after years of deficient rainfall that had crippled the industrial capacity of Bombay, and its sheer size was imagined to be a solution to any such future problems. But Koyna also reflects the intimate ways in which this conception of freedom had taken root in the region, unchaining it from the gravitational pull that the interests of the nation as a whole had exerted until this time. Koyna was born in concert with the blossoming of the regional self and was widely lobbied for by regional interests who wanted to share in the spoils of hydropower that Bombay had been cornering. The very year that its reservoir was impounded, this dam, that is now known as Maharashtra's lifeline, began to cause seismic activity. 5 years later, in 1967, it triggered a massive earthquake that first occasioned and then helped to settle scientific debates on the possibility of reservoir triggered seismicity. The conclusions that geologists have come to regarding the determinants of these tremors are unsettling, especially for the ideas on which hydroelectric developments have been based on. Two crucial ends that it pursues as a technology, height and storage, have received the strongest positive values for triggering seismicity, which means that tall dams that hold water for a long time are most likely to cause earthquakes, large earthquakes. Guided with this knowledge, the dam authorities at Koyna now have to release water from its reserves in order to prevent large seismic events in a manner that their predecessors would have deemed wasteful and even detrimental to profitability. The big dam, the lake to end all energy security problems in the region, is, in other words, too big. The aspiration to create a landscape in which and through which humanity could reduce its dependence on nature has culminated in an encounter with an aspect of nature that has severely qualified that aspiration. The tremors around Koyna, however, are continuous. When I visited the dam in November 2023, more than 121,000 seismic events had been recorded as of 7 a.m. that day. And these are no ordinary tremors produced solely by the rumbling Earth in the course of its cosmic journey. This seismic activity has been brought into being in no trivial way by the career of an idea in its journey into the mountains of Western India. These tremors, these are tremors of freedom. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. That was an incredible story. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone at CEGU, and thank you, Ryan, and Sheena. So I do have slides. So here we go. Let's see. So for about 15 years, I have traveled South Louisiana swamps and back roads, spilling styrofoam cups, I'm sorry, of gas station coffee and clapping caked mud out of my boots. I visit oil towns, salt mines, former sugar plantations, flood control structures, tourist attractions, prisons, and petrochemical refineries tucked along the banks of the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers. Sites of industry and pleasure blend seamlessly atop remains of enslaved people and displaced towns founded by Black families in the years following emancipation. It was in these many soul-sickening, lung-scorching years spent following the intertwined histories of oil, salt, and sugar in Louisiana's sinking wetlands that I came to understand resource extraction at the expense of Black lives and labor as a perverse metabolic process entangled with geological churning, colonial designs, coerced and co-opted labor, and global consumption. And so now I'm going to do the thing being that when you show up to a panel and you say, the abstract you read is about X, but since I've been writing and thinking more, you're going to get Y, which is, okay, at least a permutation of X. So I offer this. Okay. A visual encounter, right, with a 5 foot by 6 foot, and actually, so I guess this is to scale, which is terrific, multimedia work that I had created with materials from one particularly uncanny site in my research. And I'll go a little closer. I've been working on and through this piece for some time, and I came to a resolution right before this gathering. So it's probably dry by now, but it was wet when I got on the plane. And so this work takes as its starting point a deep history of oil, salt, sugar, indigenous dispossession, and chattel slavery in a region known as the Cajun Coast. And it's part of an ongoing series of mixed media pieces that articulate memory-laden sites using pigments created with unfiltered cane syrup, oil byproducts, rock salt, soil, metal shavings, and plants typically grown by enslaved people such as collards and okra. And so these palettes then animate geometric forms that emerge from overlapping geological models and diagrams, 18th and 19th century property maps, and 20th and 21st century imaging of oil fields and salt mines, resulting in a kind of like bureaucratic sublime. And the piece itself becomes a site of change, chemical reactions, and historical accretions of its own, right? As the pigments on the paper crystallize, oxidize, melt, dissipate, and congeal over time. I included this slide for scale with the help of my 2 tallest students, so you can get a sense of the size. So let's see. So I really relish the opportunity for conversation. So instead of kind of telling the fullest story that the obsessive historian piece of my brain loves to tell, I'm going to offer 3 data points or maybe provocations that articulate themselves on this surface. So first is the site. Second is its historical formation, and finally a peek under the hood of how this is made. So first, the place. We're going to the Cajun coast, and it consists about 100 miles of coastline that stretches west from New Orleans to Vermilion Bay. And the coastline forms the western part of the Mississippi River deltaic plain. and contains the oldest landforms in the coastal zone. And I've also added the Cancer Alley region here, which is the focus of other research that I have done to give a sense of just where I'm looking, though I'm not going to touch upon that today. It's perhaps the more well-known region amongst kind of environmental historians, environmental humanities scholars, with belching smokestacks and flare-ups over Black working-class towns and cemeteries. But this region, the Cajun Coast, right, took its current name from the Cajuns, a refugee community of French-Canadian settlers expelled from the colony of Acadia as a result of the 12 Years' War. They found their way to the bayous of South Louisiana, making a living from fishing and shrimping, and Cajuns, an abbreviated and accented version of the word. And although persecuted by France and Spain, with European settlers, Cajuns, they resettled on swamplands seized and populated by France and Spain with settlers and enslaved Africans decades before their arrival. It has since evolved into a kind of sportsman's paradise, as the Louisiana state motto goes. So known first as a Tuckapah territory, it encompassed a large area inhabited and protected by the Chitimacha tribe, part of the larger Tuckapah people. And though the Tuckapah were not the predominant tribe in the New Orleans area, they stewarded much of the southeast region that abuts present-day Texas. And so a map in 1822 by an erstwhile cotton trader included the location of a salt works. And this is because the Cajun Coast includes 5 formations known as the Salt Islands. And they're not really islands. Okay, wait, it's too high. But see the circular one, there's 1 at the top, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is kind of off at the bottom. They're not really islands. They are distinctive hills, right? Appearing as islands amidst swamps and flat prairie. And they're salt domes formed by subterranean deposits of solid rock salt or salt plugs. And the salt makes up the core of these domes. They were originally deposited on the bottom of the sea floor during the Jurassic era. And as sediments and oceans shifted, so did the plugs, lifting older sediments to the surface while new deposits settled on top. The seafloor salt plug became a salt dome and then a salt island. And the 5 islands are famous among geologists for purportedly having the purest rock salt in the world. And so these mushroom-shaped masses extend about 5 miles deep. And salt domes are also very effective traps for oil and gas as they accumulate in the pockets and the crevices created by the dome's uplift. So salt, right, the hard crystalline ionic compound, cuts a path to the surface of the earth, while petroleum, the viscous hydrocarbon, seeps inward and upward, twinned soon-to-be commodities. And so that island, Petit Anse, you might know it today as Avery Island, or maybe more widely known as the home of Tabasco sauce. Here's Avery Island from above. And today, Avery Island offers a Tabasco museum and a tour of the Tabasco bottling factory, in which visitors can watch primarily Black and Latino workers bottle the fermented sauces now made with peppers imported from Honduras. Surprise, surprise, more land, cheaper labor. So it is now also home to a giant gold Buddha in a pagoda on the Hill of Knowledge, overlooking a man-made swamp. And the final owner of the island, and Tabasco Baron Edward McElhenney, claimed that 2 friends in China shipped it to him as a gift. Avery Island is the site of the largest salt mine on the Cajun Coast. It's also a former sugar plantation, and it is a current oil drilling and exploration area. Avery Island rises 163 feet above sea level, making it the highest point on the entire Gulf Coast. So on this 3.5 square mile island in a sea of wetlands, receding daily into the Gulf of Mexico, right? It's uncanny, but perhaps representative of this kind of perverse petro regime, which we have taken as the center of gravity for this gathering. And so fossil records indicate the island's salt springs before their salt domes attracted various now extinct animal species, including mastodons and mammoths, dire wolves, but they are not extinct anymore, I guess, and giant sloths, among others. And carbon dating indicates that peoples inhabited the island by 2500 BC. Right, and later the Chitimacha peoples collected and used salt from these springs as well. And on nearly all of these salt islands, pieces of large vessels that were used to collect, boil, and evaporate salt water were found, and they date well up into the 17th centuries. Europeans encountered Avery Island as early as 1779 when a French doctor claimed the island. They continued to use, the colonists used the Chitimacha salt evaporation method for personal use and local sale. And accounts also arose of this time of early oil seepers, which were used primarily for lubrication and wood sealing. In 1818, John Marsh, a New Jersey sugar planter, purchased a share of the island and began to plant sugarcane on it. Up to 100 enslaved people, including children, worked on the plantation. And in the 1840s, a large rock salt deposit was discovered by an enslaved man locally known as Old Bill. And while digging a trench, he struck a white crystallized substance that he thought was a log. He tasted it and it was salt. He informed Marsh, who knew its tremendous market value and, of course, took credit for that. And once the rock salt was uncovered, Marsh called in a team of scientists and engineers to find more. And this ushered in an era of highly destructive and dangerous pit mining that continues to the present, right? And so these men and their drills that Marsh brought in, importantly, were also employed in the oil drilling business. And so their drills struck pure rock salt at a depth of 38 feet. And what I'm pointing out here is that the plantation, the mine, and the oil field were not separate formations or even linear progressions, right? But concurrent regimes, overlapping and mutually constituted networks of power, even in their earliest development. Shortly before the Civil War, Marsh sold the plantation to the Avery family and McElhenney family by marriage, who continued the sugar and mining. Here's a picture of the interior of the salt mine, and to scale a person. So these are just cavernous, just larger than the 3.5 mile island that you see rising above. Avery Island was brought into the Confederate fold, and so vegetables were hard to come by. Even rice and corn would spoil, and I am so glad we had the previous presentation because salted pork would outlast the maggots. So Avery Island salt until the mine capture by Union forces in 1863 sustained the boys in gray. The Averys and McElhenneys fled to Texas to wait out the storm. They returned and brought with them seeds from a wandering veteran and began planting hot peppers, mixing with the rock salt and vinegar to make the condiment known worldwide today. And if that weren't enough to restore the pre-war wealth of a family dependent on racialized above and below ground labor, the newly formed Humble Oil Company wanted in on the oil seepers that had been unearthed during the earliest mining days. And thus the Avery Island oil field made its way onto maps. Here's one of the earliest Humble Oil Company rigs. And it continues to today. And in fact, actually, I retrieved this map yesterday of the active wells and mineral leases. And so now we'll finally talk methods. Studies over the course of the 20th century exhibit incredible capacities of soil, air, and water to retain chemical residues and structural damage from environmental duress, such as heat, ice, floods, and industrial pollutants. And I also believe that physical material holds historical memory, and objective data can be subverted to tell richer stories of, importantly, Black and Indigenous life, and that there is pleasure in intimacy with materials, even those that represent such dark forces. And with all this in mind, I offer this idea, right, that the molecular structures of soil and water collected from these former plantation sites, mines, and oil wells are evolving and restructuring themselves due to ecological, economic, racial, and psychological violence and theft enacted upon the environment. And these practices, right, could range from soil exhaustion, erosion from deforestation, and engineering practices, and also microbiological reconfiguration from psychic energies of terror, pain, hope, and pleasure. And all of these layers and material manipulations are wrought from the very ground where exploited and expropriated peoples lived, worked, loved, laughed, and passed from this waking life, yet another kind of biosocial metabolism. And so in this vein, when making this piece, I really immersed myself in 4 elements. First is something called Banana Bayou Mound, and it's the location of most evidence of indigenous peoples, right, including simple tools, weapons, shell mounds, and charcoal from fire pits. Oh, no, I'm a quick slide. So yeah, so this is why it's called Banana Bayou. It's shaped like a banana. And on the right, you'll see a study showing where the highest concentration of materials were unearthed. My other site of interest is something called pit 4 and pit 5. Actually, pit 5 is the main one, which is the old mine, right? Or presumably where rock salt was hit for the first time by Old Bill. And then I'm also interested in Avery's sugar house on the east coast of Avery Island, where labor would be highly concentrated during the hottest months of the year for the sugar harvest. And finally, I am interested in the residential areas, including the slave quarters and cemetery, where Old Bill is said to be buried. And so what I did is I obtained soil samples from these sites, and I had them analyzed by the Louisiana State University Agricultural Extension for an array of minerals that would indicate viability of sugarcane crops, as well as collards and okra, vegetables that grow well in poor soil, particularly clay-laden areas with frequent flood events. And the idea was not to translate or interpret the data in the way a soil scientist would, but to look at it as an archival source, as a way of knowing and understanding the composition of a place, the idea that soil is not just soil, it is perhaps in quite a serious way, ancient algal kin. Thanks, Dominic. And so these components combined can help envision, for example, what life would look like for Old Bill, perhaps, as he builds levees against floods from the marsh, returns to boiling sugarcane juice, later given a break from boiling and has to go to work at the salt springs, where inevitably oil seepers are appearing and mixing with the salt. And then he returns after dark to a meal prepared with ingredients from a garden on the outskirts of the slave quarters, growing in soil deemed useless by John Marsh. To envision a world like this from numbers and figures, one must deploy a spatial rather than a chronological orientation. Low land as enclosures of racialized hierarchies, and salty land as a consolidation of labor and environmental knowledge, all kind of floating within the constantly unstable hydrological condition of South Louisiana deltaic plains, making the location of any subterranean materials here anything but static. And so I can't refine oil or drill for salt, but I can think about rearranging molecules. As a chemical engineering school dropout, I am getting a chance to use those skills. I generate small, simple reactions with these constitutive commodities, seizing different kinds of arrangements that may not result in plastic or gasoline or table salt or granulated sugar. So the pigments that I create, and that is salt right from Avery Island, and sugar and cane syrup from a plantation actually right nearby. The pigments respond to or converse with these archival materials, patterns and geometric forms that emerge from the overlay of maps and data from the site. Sometimes I physically layer them, sometimes I use projection. The pieces create possibilities for new readings of landscape and maybe upon further thought after last night's keynotes, another dimension of molecule measurement. So from molecules to mammoths, to bondage, to market, where pottery pieces and charcoal pits and mounds were unearthed, along with the old mine where we know enslaved people worked underground, to the sugar house on the edge of the island working above ground, back and forth, to and fro, up and down. And in this encounter, I encourage us to draw ourselves away from the tendency of reading a work and provocations of this kind as illustrating a historical process, and instead expressing a different kind of petro landscape, a machine driven by a kind of demonic rapacity, yet eventually broken by its own ecstatic designs, fractured, burning, but maybe even beautiful.
A bit of time for questions, comments, provocations. Why don't we take, I guess, sort of three from the audience. Start with mine.
Thanks for both incredible talks. And question for Robin. I really like this idea of expressing and not illustrating. Can't stand didactic environmental art, like this represents this, the message is this, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little more about that idea, both how that relates to your practice of expressing, not illustrating, but more generally, like if you could speak to like a praxis of representation using multimedia, using arts, that's just not didactic.
Stacking a few more questions, yes.
I have two questions, one for Sachaet and the other for Robin. So for Sachaet, I think you seem to think of freedom as something that is like a lure or like a kind of a like an illusion. But I would argue that because I'm dealing with the same problem somewhere else in the Middle East, in southwestern Iran, and I think the promise, so that this ambiguity of self-determination and illusion is used by a state to deprive people of their freedom. So it's like the fundamental question, I think, is the kind of the recipient of this self-determination and the replacement of rule of colonizer with the colonized rule. So I wonder how you think about that, because I don't have that critique of freedom in my thinking of this kind of hydroelectric project. And the second for Robin is just, again, out of my really curiosity from an agricultural history perspective. Salt and agricultural intensification are like the enemies. So I'm surprised at what are the conditions of soil here that allow for kind of sugar plantation at the site of so much salt.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Jen.
Hi, can you hear me? I just thank you for your presentations. I wanted to ask a fairly general question about genre as two people who present as historians. why was it that you digressed into in the first case a very compelling narrative, and in the second case the making of pigment and painting. And just for full disclosure's sake, I'm a literary scholar who also makes poetry and other things. So I'm often asked this myself, and I'm very curious about what led you both to break into these other genres. What is it about the discipline of history, that can stand to benefit from such ruptures?
The first?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I don't mind.
No particular one.
Oh yeah, you go ahead. Yeah, because I like the last question a lot. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, about your question on freedom. So I one of the things that I'm arguing in my dissertation, of which this is a chapter, is that in the 19th century in South Asia, a set of words come to denote freedom more frequently than an older set. This set starts to replace and contend with a set that had been used in play for thousands of years in South Asia. And there's a revaluation of which set is more sort of worthwhile to think with. The new set includes words like, if you listen to the sounds a little bit, Swaraj, Swatantra, Swadhin, and replacing an older set that includes words like moksha and mukti. So the new set sort of denotes a kind of relationship of the self to itself, self-rule, self-dependence, one's own techniques, replacing an older set that connoted something closer to the liberation of the self from the endless cycle of death and rebirth. So I think in the 19th century in India, people start to think with this um, new set of words more frequently, and these two sets contend with each other, in the 19th century. And this new valuation is consummated in the early 20th century in a very famous Indian nationalist reading of the Bhagavad Gita, where he argues that uh, it's no more the case that Indians should strive for liberation from the endless cycle of death and rebirth. That is not the task of Indians anymore, but it must be self rule. One must strive not for escape, and one must cultivate not an ethic of renunciation, but instead an ethic of self determination and an ethic of action. And I think this new understanding, this new conception of freedom starts to materialize itself in different ways in South Asia. And I think one arena in which it materializes itself is this sort of infrastructural domain and in this kind of economic domain. So most people, I think, when they look and they search for freedom, they look at politics. They look at social movements. But I think that misses the ways in which this freedom was also conceived of as a freedom from nature. And I think that's what early Indian nationalists started to kind of think of as well. So they had both of the semantic carrying capacity of this word freedom extended, I think, in many different directions. And so my work is, I think, is an attempt to ground that relationship with nature that emerges in the 19th century in something more complex, and in the same kinds of struggles that I think you were talking about and you were interested in. And it's kind of motivated by this search for common ground, right? And I think in a lot of literature on climate change and the Anthropocene lately, I think people have started talking more about freedom. Dipesh Chakrabarty's famous, argument that the mansion of modern freedoms is based on ever increasing base of fossil fuel use, right? So these kinds of formulations had me wondering, what does this freedom really mean? Like what kind of freedom is this? This is not the older Indian sense of liberation from the endless cycle of death and rebirth. This is a worldly freedom, a kind of freedom that means something for the self's relationship to itself. And in that way, I mean, in that kind of mode, I'm thinking about an early kind of framing of this project was a kind of critique of hydroelectrical reason. That's how I was thinking about it. So a critique of this concept of freedom when it's applied to objects that I think it's not appropriate to apply it to. Whereas I think perhaps its value and its kind of power may lie more appropriately in the domains that you described, and to I mean directed towards others and objects that are human. I think to the question of genre, I I can only offer my very minimal sort of reflections on what I find compelling about history as a discipline. And I've been recently thinking more about history in the kind of in the mode of historia magistra vitae, and history as the teacher of life. And I've been trying to think about how I can fold my archival material into some kind of story that might help us learn something about the ways in which modernity inhabits the world and how modern human beings experience the world, and by sort of um, framing this material in this kind of narrative form. I also hope to maybe challenge the ideas on which some of these material unfoldings are based on. And I think a narrative form enables me to do that in a way that um, imbues some of this material with some kind of life and some kind of interest. Because I think another interest of mine is to maybe write things that I hope some of my friends back home might want to read, and none of them are academics, and none of them even really read. But I hope that, and but I found, I mean, I was in India for a year and a half, and I found that telling them stories was something that um, got them interested.
And that was perfect. So I'm going to do the questions starting from genre and going backward. So I describe myself as a late onset historian. My training is not in history. It is actually in fine art and printmaking. Well, after the dropping out of engineering school. So first dropping out of engineering school and then training as an artist. Artist and designer, and then kind of coming to and now I'm going back to the question of expression and praxis, has always been a series of not necessarily what discipline do I belong to, or what are the tools required to follow curiosities and commitments. And it has happened, luckily, to coincide with some institutional formations over the years. Lucky me. But I think actually that the history, right, is a way of speaking to the use of materials and the use of putting my hands in something, which is why I also struggle with digital archives, is something that's so important to kind of what you're talking about, like really wrenching a story out of something. And I think how I was describing like the soul crushing, sickening times in Cancer Alley, I've asked, how do you tell a history of like you had to be there? Or and is that possible? Is it ethical? But you have to try, right? And to do that, history is just not, it's just not enough. The archive, the maps, the geological diagrams, the soil, ethnographies, all of this, it all has to come together. And kind of a piece of this praxis that was left out of the presentation is that a lot of this pigment making and collecting And research happens with communities who are living in that area, or people who have been descendants who want to bring materials of great memory and import to their families and communities, and that these pigments, even though I was showing you where I was making them by myself, many times they're made with a group of people. And so this kind of block and the muller, it can take like hours to bind like dirt and kind of different dyes together. That's this very labor intensive process that one person will get tired of doing, so you have to hand it over to the next person. And so in a way, right, the method has a lot of historical elements to it. I suppose this can be legible in many ways to folks firmly planted in history departments, but I think of it as just what is necessary to follow the curiosities and bring other people into it as well. The salt and sugar question is incredible, and this is why it's so uncanny, and I can't quite understand it either. And the LSU Ag Center people have been doing their darndest to explain these things to me, as I go back and forth and say, but isn't it like wild that the memories of these are together? And they're like, well, lady, do you want the nitrogen readings or or what? And so what I've parsed though actually is I can come back here to one of these, is that largely the mining is happening at that bottom, this one where it says mine, and there's you can see that there's actually a whole sort of almost like an irrigation flushing chute through the island that coincides with the railroad, incidentally, that kind of goes and it flushes all of the salt that's coming up out. And the sugarcane fields particularly are on that Banana Bayou strip there. And so the soil in those areas are actually tested differently for elevation and salinity. And I think historically and still now, and there's been sinkholes and explosions with these like flushing canals that keep constantly like sucking the salt out and kind of depositing it back down.
Anyway, that makes sense because there should be some way of kind of water actually constantly washing down, which
Yes.
adds to the labor because it's not
Yes.
basically like a bad land.
Yes. Yes. And so when you see like old pictures of it, it looks like rice plantation fields, like a whole series of those yes. Yeah. And so there's these elaborate systems on the banana piece, and these just like wild like salt waste water shoots out the back.
We are 5 minutes over. Neil, I want to put a smile on your face. So should I cut us off here and then allow the next panel to set up?
The dilemma is that we want to try to stay on schedule because we've got another panel, and then we also traditionally in this conference end the day with like a roundtable discussion with everyone. So we could do another 10 minutes, but the only way we could do it, I see all the hands, and obviously like literally like a kind of 30-second question in the interest of kind of articulating thoughts, and then we offer literally a minute.
Sorry?
Or, I mean, what do you think?
How do you all feel?
How do you all feel?
I'd love to take questions.
I'm up for a lightning round.
Lightning round. Yeah.
Keyword.
20 seconds each, yes.
Like more or less.
Aaron, first of all.
Okay, Robin, one of the things that's really striking here is that the space is so three-dimensional, and so I wonder how you think about that in terms of an artistic form that is on a, relatively flat plane. And what that historically what that's meant about like conflicts that exist in the space above and below the surface. And so, Sachaet, what if we think about the dam as fixed capital, not just something that is moving?
Lourdes.
Quickly, Robin, I'm curious if the existence of these like underground salt formations, like as islands, I'm thinking of some of the other salt islands, like in Turks and Caicos.
Yeah.
I'm very curious about if islands are doing anything for you in your thoughts.
Yeah, question for Sachaet, just because I know you're interested in conceptual intellectual history. It seemed like in your talk, the story about tradition modernity used Hegel, and it seems like there's this contention between samsara and Hegelian freedom, and perhaps the revenge of samsara at the very end. But I wonder if you're reading this in the sources, or if you're kind of bringing Hegel to the story. Have you perhaps encountered Indian intellectuals who are thinking about traditional Indian philosophy in light of Hegelian philosophy, or are you kind of bringing this from the outside?
Take us home.
For the question of freedom also, how did this lead to different calls for freedom today? Let's say Azadi or CEGU or other struggles around past or other kinds of politics society naturals.
All right, I'll go. The 3D question. I think Tiffany Lathabo King talks about looking at the plantation at the scale of the poor. And if you actually zoom in on the pieces, they actually create their own salt ridges and mountains. And as they like mold over and do all this interesting stuff, they're like these whole worlds built on top of the paper that I can obsess over forever. So I love playing with that scale. Islands, yes, also thinking a lot with Chelsea Shields' new work, Offshore Attachments. Oh my gosh. And that idea, right, of that islands and islanding can be used to offshore, take the financial idea of offshoring, but offshoring people and labor and exchange. So islands are perfect to think with.
Yeah, maybe just to start with quickly to answer your questions, Chris. I don't really see this as a relationship, of like Hegel and samsara as much as I do as much as I see this question as a question of concepts and how material reality kind of challenges those concepts, So how whether those concepts can change or not is, I think up to the people who kind of put them into place. But like that's how I'm seeing this kind of a relationship play out. And I think there are two ways to answer your second question as well. I think there are a lot of Indian intellectuals and Indian politicians and reformers who are reading Hegel and who are reading Kant and who are kind of like engaging with those ideas. But I think there's also another way to think about Hegel, which is not to see Hegel as someone that intellectuals sort of read and like appropriate, but to see, as Andrew Sartori has done, to see elements of the kind of material reality of a particular region as making intuitively available certain concepts, right? Like, and that's the kind of sense in which I, think it's interesting to think about Hegel as well, because he represents, in some way, the raising to a kind of conceptual sophistication of the kind of ideas of commercial society, right? So I think both of those modes of engaging with Hegel, I think are sort of there, in my kind of work. To Casey's question about how this relates to other kinds of freedom, I think that's one of the things that I'm interested in doing, to kind of offer up the ways in which our understanding of freedom or the modern understanding of freedom has been dominated by this sense of self-determination. Azadi is another fascinating word, another fascinating concept with different kind of etymological roots. You go really, really far back, you trace Azadi to like its Persianate and then Proto-Indo-European roots. And Azadi has a lot to do with generation, with being born, So I think, maybe keeping these other sort of meanings, of freedom with us may help us orient ourselves in the world in interesting and, in ways that don't necessarily lead us into the same kinds of problems, right? Like that thinking exclusively with freedom as self-determination may lead us into. Aaron, I encourage you to think of the dam as fixed capital. I haven't done that.
Perfect place to end with 5 minutes to spare. So join me again in thanking both of our panelists.